Hi YouTube, it's Kathy and this is my weekly entertainment wrap-up for February 20th through 26th. This week I read one book, I watched 4 shows, I watched 2 movies, and I listened to 2 books. First on this list, and possibly the last book I will complete for the Rent Readathon, depending on how this week goes before we get directly into March, I read A Queer and Pleasant Danger. This one actually has a very long and extremely descriptive subtitle, and I don't want to mess up the exact wording, so I'm going to read it to you. That subtitle reads as follows: The true story of a nice Jewish boy who joins the Church of Scientology and leaves 12 years later to become the lovely lady she is today. This is a memoir, and from that subtitle you can probably figure out that we're talking about being Jewish, we're talking about Scientology, we're talking about being trans and gender politics and things of that nature. What that doesn't tell you immediately is this book was published about a decade ago, and at the time I believe Kate was in her early 60s, and she actually wrote this in part so if her daughter or her grandchildren leave Scientology, they can actually learn about her. You see, when she left, she was labeled a suppressive person, and people in the church are not allowed to talk to people outside of the church, especially people labeled as suppressive persons. Essentially, Kate knows that if she contacts her family within the church, they will get in trouble for it, and she doesn't want to rip away the only thing they've ever known because her daughter was born into it. Kate is an author, a playwright, an activist, and has had a very interesting life. All of that being said, Kate is obviously from an older generation and uses language that we wouldn't necessarily use today, but it is the appropriate language for how she grew up. And I do want to clarify here that she's using language that has to do with being trans. That is older than we use now, not that she's older and being racist and I'm saying that's fine, because that's not what I meant. Because that's not appropriate at any age, whereas this is just language has changed over time. This memoir also has content warnings for blood and suicidal ideation, and probably a lot more, so I've linked down below a couple of resources to check out trigger warnings for everything you read, because I'm always going to miss some. On to what I watched this week. It might seem that I didn't consume all that much this week until you realize that this first show that I watched, called Coroner by the way, I watched the first 3 seasons. That being said, that's only 26 episodes, but yes, I did watch all of the seasons that are currently available on Netflix because the 4th season is currently being broadcast on the CBC. What drew me to this show is it is a medical drama, and I'm a fan of those, and this one is actually set in Toronto, so I thought it would be interesting to see one that is set in Canada. As with every show, this one has a lot of moving parts, but our main character is Jenny Cooper. She is the coroner for Ontario West, and she works in Toronto. She is a relatively young woman in the field, so initially there is one character that gives her pushback for that. But one of the things I love about this show is there's a huge diversity not only in the ethnicity of the characters, but as well as the sexuality, and for the most part it doesn't really come up. It's very normalized that this is what the world looks like. And it's not only when people are being terrible to them that these types of diversity are brought up. For example, it is very easy to see just watching the show that it is very ethnically diverse. Our main character's partner on the police force is a black man. She has various indigenous people who work with and for her. The other 2 cops we see the most of, especially in the first season, you can tell are minorities. And then it's just so effortlessly slipped in that our main character's son is gay and has a boyfriend, and that relationship is adorable. As well as somebody she works with is a single lesbian, but she is having a baby because that's what she wants to do. Like many cop medical dramas, there's obviously things that probably wouldn't go down in the real world. For example, her going out to interview suspects with the police officer, probably not an actual coroner thing. But the show does a pretty good job of balancing what happens in the lab, what happens in the field, and then what happens at home, because everybody in this has something going on with them. For example, there are several characters who have mental health issues in this show, including our main character who has panic attacks, anxiety, and other issues you'll get into if you watch the show. Of course, I also stayed current on RuPaul's Drag Race UK versus the World, and this episode was the Snatch Game. They did it in a different format this time, so it was Family Feud style version of Snatch Game, so 3 queens on one team, 3 on the other, and then each of them had either Michelle Visage or Katie Price as kind of the leaders of their teams. There were some people that did fine during this challenge, and then there were some people who really excelled at this challenge. In addition, because this is all-star rules, somebody who was doing very, very well in this competition ultimately went home, because that's the type of thing that can happen with all-star rules. I also stayed current on season 14 of RuPaul's Drag Race. In this one, the girls were split up into 3 different 60s girls groups and had to write their own lyrics for a song. This, as usual, was very fun, and then the runway, there were some gorgeous looks as well. The category was Heart On. And I'm definitely going to miss the queen that went home, but I can completely understand why she was in the bottom. I also watched the second episode of The Gilded Age because I needed something to watch while I was waiting for other things to happen. If you're not aware of this show, it's made by the same person who made Downton Abbey, except it's set in New York and is tangentially related, but we haven't exactly seen how it's related yet. I have some theories, but that's fine. Essentially, this is a story about the old money and the new money in New York, as well as people in the servant class. I really enjoy it, and I really enjoyed the power move that happened near the end of this episode. On to the movies I watched. There were two of them, the first one being Now You See Me. This one is about magicians who are doing a heist. And what I really like about it is there's a lot of time where you're just like, is this really magic? Did they really do this magic? How did they do it? I didn't know anything about this going in, I didn't really have any expectations, and I had fun with it. And that's basically all I want from a movie like this, because sure, there were a couple of clever things, but even as the movie was happening, people were like, oh, I see why they're doing this right now because they're gonna do this in the future. Last night we also watched the 1995 version of Jumanji, which was a lot of fun because I don't think I've watched it since the 90s. Also, I will jump at most opportunities to watch a Robin Williams movie because I miss that guy. This, if you've never heard about it, technically takes place over 126 years because in the very beginning it is 1869 and these people are burying something and you don't know what it is. And then 100 years later, in 1969, this kid ends up digging it up because he can hear these drum beats coming from this trunk on a construction site, and he basically opens up the trunk and there's a game in it and he's like, cool, this is mine now. So he takes it back to his extremely large house, starts playing the game with somebody, and whatever he rolls actually sucks him into the game until somebody else rolls a 5 or an 8. Flash forward 26 years later and we have an aunt and her two nibblings moving into this house because she is now their guardian because their parents died. It's the same house that we saw 26 years previously. They find the same game, they start playing, they get him out of the board, and things just go from there. This is one of those movies that's oddly wholesome and full of such interesting action sequences. I mean, sure, yes, there were animatronics used and that type of thing, but there was also a part where they flooded the entire house and it looked like everybody was going to drown. And that's something that I don't remember seeing a lot in that time frame. Obviously, there was danger in the time frame of the movies, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about how there was a lot of destruction, especially for a kid's movie, and if it wasn't for how the ending kind of wraps up, you would be left with this property that is absolutely worth nothing because it's covered in vines, animals have destroyed it, it's had a flood. It would be a very interesting thing to try to talk to your insurance broker about, that's all I'm saying. On to the books I listened to, the first one being one that I read for the 12 challenge, and that was Gearbreakers. I'm not going to talk a lot about this one because I did overall enjoy it, and I'm glad that Rachel suggested it for this challenge. However, listening to a book about war this week was not my best reading experience, so even though I overall enjoyed the book, I just don't feel like talking about it all that much given the world circumstances. I will tell you that this is about two opposing sides, one that has all the power because they've created these mechas, and then another side that is trying to basically just break into the mechas and break them so they break down the power structures. From that, we get to see somebody who is a pilot of one of the mechas and has never wanted to be there and what her whole backstory is, and then obviously we get to see the side of the Gearbreakers and learn that whole cast of characters found family dynamic. Obviously, I'm a fan of that trope, so I especially enjoyed all the parts where all these characters were just working together towards a common goal. However, it just wasn't an especially good time for me to be reading a war book. The other audiobook I listened to was Watch Over Me. I listened to all of it yesterday while I was pet sitting for my best friend. This is a book about a girl who has done something in her past that she's not especially proud of, and we don't know exactly what it is as the book starts. In addition, she's kind of aged out of living with her foster family and is now taking a job kind of in the middle of nowhere, where she is one of the people who teaches kids who are in this much larger foster facility. And that makes it sound like it's an institution, but really it's just a lot of foster kids who have been adopted by this one couple. So many, in fact, that they have 3 different people teaching the different age groups for their kids when it comes to homeschooling. When she arrives, there's this one kid named Lee. He's the only one kind of in his age group, but soon they're probably getting a couple more kids in that age group. So they have a lot of one-on-one time, and she kind of gets to know his backstory. He kind of gets to know hers. In addition, this is a ghost story, so people at this location see ghosts kind of around all the time, and sometimes they're scared of them, and sometimes they aren't. This also flits back and forth between her life now and her life before before she went into the foster system, and we get to know what kind of led up to that, and the things that she's facing and the fears that she has and all of those types of things. I knew absolutely nothing going into this book, and I actually really love picking up books by authors who I've read 1 or 2 books from before and know nothing about the plot and just seeing how it unfolds. And this book gave me a lovely reading experience. That's it for this week. If you've read, watched, or listened to any of these, let me know about it down in the comments below. On the way down to the comments, if you hit that subscribe button, that would be very nice of you. If you don't feel like leaving a comment but want to make sure that I know you were here, just leave me an emoji or a smiley face if you happen to be on your keyboard. You can like and share this as you see fit, and I will see you very soon. Bye!